Hi everyone, I'm Wendy Muse, creator of the LeftPOC Project, which seeks to bring you the history of leftists of color, one swipe at a time. And this is the LeftPOC Project podcast. On today's episode, Richard and I continue with our discussion of Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and we are sad because this is our final episode, part 3, of course, of a longer series for the Reading Revolution segment of our podcast. So just make sure that you catch up with parts 1 and 2 if you have a chance. And feel free to send us any questions, concerns, or issues that you'd like for us to cover on the next Reading Revolution series. In the meantime, be sure to check out the Twitter page, and that's at LeftPOC, and also to check out the Patreon page, which actually has a lot of free books, including the one that we read for this episode, as well as additional details about the podcast, the project, and much, much more. We keep all of our content free at the LeftPOC Project, but if you'd like to become a $1 donor or a $5 comrade, you would do that there at patreon.com. Anyway, on with the show. So I'm back today with my co-host. So exciting. Co-host Richard.
Yay. I'm excited.
And we're going to be continuing with our third and final installment of our discussion of Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Hopefully by now, everyone who's been following us can say properly conscientização. That's the test at the end of this episode. I'm just kidding. But yeah, I hope...
Just telling her I was nervous, and now she does that.
No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, the real thing is not whether or not you can pronounce it, but whether or not you understand it, which I think all of us, and hopefully everyone who's been listening very much can. And hopefully if they get a chance to read the book themselves, they'll learn even more about that and kind of get to really feel it and see it in their everyday interactions. So yeah, thank you for joining me. Did you want to start us off with some thoughts first?
Just thank you so much for having me, and I'm happy and I feel honored to be a part of the project and now as a co-host, and I'm looking forward to what we have coming, and I hope everybody else is. And for all that you've done and for all that's been done, I just want to thank all the all the patrons out there that have subscribed to the Patreon, and I actually went through a lot of the other podcast venues and saw a lot of positive reviews, and have been looking at the LeftPOC account and saw a lot of positive reactions to the first 2 parts. And just thank all of you so much. It's meant a lot to me, and it both being a patron and doing whatever you can to give positive feedback or to share the podcast with others has been incalculably valuable to me. And so I just want to reach out and thank all of you. And if any of y'all can, reach down in the cushions or ashtrays or wherever and scrape together $1 to spend one place, and then you can slide us $1 or become a comrade on the Patreon. It will go. It helps us all. It helps not just me and Wendy. There's others in the project that are coming along, and I'm just really excited for all that we're doing. And every $1 that you guys that y'all are able to kick down to us really makes a difference, and helps us do what we're doing here, both the Reading Revolution and the LeftPOC Project in general. So I just really want to thank y'all, and reach out to those that can to support us in the ways that you can, whether that's tweeting or writing positive reviews or wherever else it is. So that's the first thing I wanted to say.
Yeah, I think we should also emphasize, and we had a little discussion about this off air, but sometimes when you're watching YouTube videos, because of their weird algorithm, you might end up being kicked over to like strange alt-right stuff, or things that are extremely reactionary, unintended, like you don't want it, but it unintentionally does that through the algorithm they have. And one of the things that sort of helps algorithms and helps people find videos or content or podcasts or whatever is actually leaving reviews. So if you're listening to us on iTunes, we would highly suggest and request actually that you leave us a nice review. If you enjoy what we're saying and you like the podcast, you want to hear more from us, you're learning a lot, please feel free to let people know. And especially if you've left a comment on Twitter, which, like, yes, I agree with you, Richard. Sometimes, I run the LeftPOC Twitter page, and when I see the notifications, I'm always like, oh my God, people are so nice. They're like nice people left in the world, which is easy to forget when you use Twitter on a regular basis. But yeah, we have some amazing listeners, and I learned so much from y'all, and like your contributions are amazing as well. And so any way that you can help, whether it's monetary or not, it's irrelevant. I just think that any little bit really does count. But the money also helps. I just like did a massive breakdown, like one of these, I was joking with Richard and saying it's sort of like a Rain Man style chart for the 80s babies in the room who remember Rain Man, the movie. But it's like, how much am I spending out of pocket? How much are we spending for guests? How much am I spending? There's a lot of money that actually goes into running the podcast. Not a ton, like you don't need $50,000 to run a podcast, but you do need a considerable amount of money to pay for things like web storage, to pay assistants, to pay people to do transcripts, to pay, for example, for LeftPOC, I pay the guests just like a small thing to say thank you, small amount of money to say thank you. And then I also give funding to their charity or organization of their choice. So like for me, a big part of this project is not just about what we do for the podcast or what I do on the social media page, but also to be able to give back to various communities and to also just like show support of the guests that we have on. I mean, this takes time. We both know that it takes time to be on a podcast because we sit here for hours every few weeks discussing and reading and preparing and editing and whatever. But also, like the people whose job it is to research this stuff and to write about it, and then we have them on our show. I mean, that ultimately is time out of their incredibly busy schedules, and so they deserve to be paid, and we pay them what we can. I wish it were more, but we do really try to live what we talk about, and put what we talk about in action, which is fitting because these next two chapters we're going to talk about today are all about the sort of action side of a lot of what we've been talking about in the previous two chapters that was more theory based. So we'll get into that in just a minute. But yeah, just wanted to put that out there. And thank you again so much, Richard, for being on the show, for giving me some of your time, a lot of your time. And yeah, I appreciate you too. And I'm really glad that you have come on to the show. So thank you.
Oh, absolutely. And I just wanted to add that those taking your time out to thank us in the ways that all of you have, besides making a difference personally, it does make a difference in the algorithm, like Wendy mentioned, and especially on other platforms, iTunes, the Soundcloud, when you may also like suggestions come up for other various podcasts, but those are the types of things that they look for. So if you're listening to Millennials Are Killing Capitalism, then you come over and listen to the new LeftPOC project and you drop a like on both, that encourages other people or vice versa to go do the same thing through the algorithm. And so that is very helpful for everyone involved and for all the projects. And I've been involved in several projects over the last several years towards left organizing, and as far as living the praxis and the theory and all that, the LeftPOC project has been the one that I've been a part of that has done that to the best and to the most degree. And Wendy, I can't appreciate Wendy enough for that. Like it's not easy. She does a lot behind the scenes that she doesn't talk about or ask for credit for or anything. She just does work, and it's very appreciated. And those that can help compensate, I very much appreciate that Wendy gets that she can get that, and because she's a very selfless person and deserves every bit of it. But with that, I do want to get into the text.
Turning to Freire now, who's like way more selfless than everyone else. He did a lot, and he has quite a bit. As you know, we hear some people say, like when someone says something really important, like amazing and life changing, and you say, "Wow, that was a word." right? I'm sure people have heard this, right? He
Mhm.
talks about the meaning of the word in chapter 3. He literally starts with that. And so we're going to give, this time is going to be a little bit different than the other discussions, just because, like I'd mentioned sort of briefly in passing, these two chapters really are more, in my opinion at least, they came across as a lot more direct and literal in a lot of ways, and it's mainly a breakdown of definitions, meanings of things, how to put stuff into action, what he means by love and word and praxis and all these things. He spends a lot of time in the third and fourth chapter defining things and giving hardcore examples. So I think it's very helpful, almost in some ways. We were talking about this before off air, but it felt like sometimes like we should have read the book in reverse because sometimes there are things in chapter 3 and 4 that help better illuminate what he's talking about in chapters 1 and 2. But in it, no matter what order you read it in, these chapters are really helpful in cementing what we had talked about in the first two chapters of the book. The other thing I wanted to add really quickly is the fact that this is in no way comprehensive, right? I highly suggest that if you do have a chance to go read the book on your own time, definitely do that and work through some of these questions and issues that he raises throughout. This is just a podcast, so we can't do everything. It would be nice, I would love to just teach a whole class on this book and just, talk about all of its twists and turns and historical intricacies and things like that. But we can only do so much in a podcast. But I hope, is very much my hope, that what we have discussed thus far has sort of encouraged you to either pick it up yourself, or if you're reading along with us and you've already read it, that we hope that our discussion has helped kind of underline some of the really important aspects that we took away, and then help you find new ones that you can take away and share with others. So yeah, beginning with chapter 3, Richard, do you want to maybe start us off for a quick review, and then I'll chime in when necessary for chapter 3?
Yeah, one of the first things that we start with for in chapter 3 is that that the dialogue project or process can't be the act of depositing. So we covered in part 2 about what the depositing banking method is, and that it's not about objectifying the masses and thinking that there's a message that they need to consume. It's about raising their consciousness, and in the process raising your own consciousness together, and that it can't happen, that one person can't save another and one person can't save themselves, but that we have to work together in order to both raise our consciousness and liberate ourselves. That is going to be an overarching theme throughout chapter 3 and 4.
Yeah, and one of the things too that is like really important about this dialogue is, obviously, if you just break down the meaning of that word, right, it has literally two in it, like die,
Yeah.
And you have to have two people. Log has to do with word, right? So if you break down the word dialogue, you're literally looking at what becomes a mutual experience, right? It's not one person telling the other person, or it's not one person, just as you were mentioning, referring to chapter 2, it's not a banking, it's not a depositing of knowledge. It's an interactive formation of knowledge. And I think one of the things that like really stood out to me for this chapter, just as, even though it's in the very beginning, but it's something I think is a big standout, is the fact that, lots of people attempt or pretend to have dialogue, right? And it's not really dialogue. It's just top down telling, basically. So it's a sort of faked, and what Freire considers an alienated or alienating pablum. It's blah, 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 blah. It's not necessarily something that will be life-changing. And it's not anything that bears with it as well, or that carries with it a commitment to change, right? It's just noise. And I think that we're going to get into this a bit later, some ways that this applies to the present. But I think right now, in an election season, we can think about this all day long. The ways that sometimes language can feel empty, cannot be as fulfilling as it should be. And that's something that he really cautions against through the bulk of chapter 3. The other thing really quickly is that he talks a lot about, in this chapter 2, what activism should look like. And so not just word and not just language and interaction, but also what it means to, like, what does it mean to put things into action if you don't have any sort of theoretical understanding of what you're doing, if you don't have background or thought behind what you're doing, if you're just acting to act. He basically says, this is not the best way to go. It's not good to be just about words, and it's not good to be just about action. You have to combine the two. Both of them have to be foregrounded in thought.
Mm-hmm. And they're like inextricable from each other, and one without the other is empty and essentially counterproductive. And I think that's something that we definitely see a lot. Just quickly on the communication side, the similarity that just comes to my mind is, when your boss says they have good communication with the team, when their communication is sending out memos or directives and never taking anything the other way through this one-way channel. And that's often what we see in organizational spaces, in politics, in the workplace, at home, everywhere in a lot of our lives. And I think that one of the other arching themes is that our political imagination, and he uses phrasings of limited, or he uses other phrasings that we'll get to a little bit later, but essentially that we have to think beyond the current situation, and that takes a recognition that reality is something that we're making, not a static it's always been this way kind of presentation as the oppressors will often present it.
Mm-hmm. I think the boss example you gave is really good too, because not only is there a power-based structural dynamic there, right? Because someone has the ability to grant you your paycheck or not, right? Like that creates already a stilted sense of dialogue. But as you said, it's not necessarily listening to the other side. It's just dictating, in which case there's not necessarily someone waiting for the response and waiting to hear back and understand what the other side thinks and what they need most specifically. The other thing too that is, I think, really great about this chapter is that, and I brought this up when we had our earliest discussions, but one of the questions I had was, as I was reading, what does he mean by love? He talks about love a lot in the earlier chapters. And I kept saying to myself, okay, like I understand it in general, what he means, but I wanted to know with more specificity, what does love look like in a revolutionary sense, a revolutionary context? And when you go to page 89, 90, he kind of starts to break that down a bit more. And he even cites Che Guevara in his discussion of the significance of love in revolutionary acts. But he says that on page 89, Freire says, love is at the same time the foundation of dialogue and dialogue itself, and that love is an act of courage, not of fear. Love is commitment to others. No matter where the oppressed are found, the act of love is commitment to their cause, the cause of liberation. And I think, he says also a bit before that dialogue cannot exist in the absence of a profound love for the world and for people. And this is really important because I think sometimes we get so bogged down with negativity. And I think we see, like, there's so much going on in the world that it's hard to even consider that there's love. And I think that, we do see people, thank God, that are very, very, very committed to what they do. And you can see that they really do care. They really are listening, and they really are working toward some sort of change that's not just about replacing the people with power with another group of people who are going to exert the same kind of, if not worse, power over others. And, you, Richard, have often talked about this. When we started the series, you were talking a lot about it and I think emphasizing it. So if people are listening to this third section, go back and kind of consider what Richard was saying earlier on. He was giving us a little teaser about what love means in a revolutionary context that I think is really important to the reading of this book.
On that note, it really kind of piled several things together for me in my mind. For a while now, I've had the Fred Hampton quote, why don't you live for the people, work for the people, why don't you die for the people? And I've mentioned in a previous podcast, I don't remember which one, that the first two I was on board with, but the third one was hard for me to wrap my mind around. Mm-hmm. And I had heard Fred speak on it before, and I had started to come across it here. And what struck me was, and was kind of confusing in this text and really brought it full circle, was how he refers to essentially oppressors as necrophilic, lovers of death.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that concept of that, when Fred says, if you're afraid of socialism, you're afraid of yourself. If you're not for the freedom, this is just me paraphrasing here, but essentially that without freedom, you're dead already. And so, like, and I kind of understood that, and I mean, it's a sentiment I've heard several times, but like, enough things have happened that it kind of finally registered to me that it's just a little piece at a time, that you have to sacrifice something that you believe in, or some truth, or righteous perspective. It's like, I would never do something that would harm a child, and then you find out, oh, actually children were being used to mine the materials that are in my cell phone. So I guess
Mm-hmm.
I kind of did. And so it's like, how you wrap your mind around that is kind of the difference. And the oppressors are necrophilic in their love for death, and that they want to kill any sensation or urge for you to understand that in a critical way. And they much rather you understand that in a, well, that's the cost of capitalism, that's the way it's always been. Those people are in their situation because of choices they've made, or because of the superiority of Western culture, or any of the many, many myths that also Freire goes on to lay out later on. And that kind of theme of this, your unfortunate circumstances are your own fault, or a result of a world beyond your change, or anything you can change, is fundamental to the entire concept of the oppressors in holding down the ability of the masses to critically analyze and change the world around them. And uh, part of the love and is both recognizing that that's a human right, and then he also goes on to mention faith. And I'll quote Freire here. It says, dialogue further requires an intense faith in humankind, faith in their power to make and remake, to create and recreate, faith in their vocation to be more fully human, which is not the privilege of an elite, but the birthright of all. And that's to say that the world is what we make it, and it's our right, it's all of our right to make it. And a lot of people fear, what if I let Trump supporters influence that world? And to a degree, Freire addresses that with the need for real dialogue and real critical thinking. But he also recognizes the practical situation in that, if you want, if Freire seems to be more of a nonviolent revolutionary from my perspective in reading through this
Mm-hmm.
text, particularly compared to some of our previous texts. And so, if you want a nonviolent revolution and you recognize the futility of the democratic system as it exists, then what you need is, you need an intense faith in the people, that if you share with them a way to uh, raise, to critically analyze the world around them, that they can get there. And I know Twitter, or being online, or even in some you know like personal situations, can make people feel like, oh, there's no way that you can ever change this person's mind. And part of the thing that Freire addresses throughout the text is that it's not about changing their mind. Uh, it's about in together raising your ability to critically analyze the world around you. And so, in that, you change like, a successful interaction would be one in which you were able to uh, share in a dialogue that allowed both of you to more clearly identify and recognize and act on the world around you. And so, uh, in that process, Freire suggests that uh, when the oppressor tries to imitate this behavior to further oppression, uh, they will always fail. That doesn't mean that they won't rise to power, but it will always, it can never be a genuine revolution, and it will always fail for the reasons of not being a genuine revolution.
Right. It's like the information. I mean, one of the things that when you mentioned Trump supporters and things like that, and also your discussion of having faith in the population, one of the things that I kept thinking about as well is, it depends on what information you're getting, right? Like all of the
Mm-hmm.
information that we get is tainted in some way at this point, especially, and I'm just thinking mainly of corporate media, right? Whether
And
it's
our own
Fox or,
minds and our own minds are colonized and
of
full of
course,
all sorts of like hegemonic ideas that have to be systematically removed to continue.
yeah, no, it's like a lifelong process of learning these things
Mm-hmm.
and then needing to unlearn them, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that also sort of holds it. This is building a bit on what you had mentioned earlier, but it definitely holds back the prospect of dialogue in some cases. And part of that learned behavior, and learned like false consciousness of sorts, I don't really like that term, but it's sort of like a false sense of knowledge, comes from oppressors and people who have an immense amount of power. And so sometimes it's hard to get to the point where you can work together, to learn together, to have a dialogue, because these things sort of exist as barriers. I think at the same time, though, people who have good intentions, and Freire talks about this later on. We're around page. Let me give you the exact page. Page 95. One of the things that he talks about here is the fact that even people with good intentions sometimes don't do things the right way when they're trying to engage in this active dialogue. And unfortunately, they don't have, say, any faith in the people they're working among, and assume, as we've talked about, not we, you and me, but in other cases of, activism, things like that, have talked about this idea of serving as saviors to the population. He says on 95, talking about people who are trying to change. He says, the task implies that revolutionary leaders do not go to the people in order to bring them a message of salvation, quote unquote salvation, but in order to come to know through dialogue with them both their objective situation and their awareness of their situation. And he talks a lot about in this section as well about the fact, like, don't assume that people who are oppressed don't recognize what's going on. They may not have solutions that work yet, but they are in many cases thinking about it. It's not that they're like completely unconscious and don't know. At the same time, he has a bit of a discussion in this chapter where he talks about, in some cases, there are people who are in a situation where they're being severely oppressed, and they look at their situation because of the teachings that they've received from the oppressor, and either don't recognize it or they don't recognize themselves as a member of the oppressed, right? This also goes back to stuff that he discusses in the first part, but that there has to be a moment of recognition, and that doesn't always come from the outside. It usually comes from within. There's a moment, there's a break where you say, there's something off here, there's something wrong. And you might not use the right, quote unquote, right language, or might not have the right way, quote unquote, right way to express yourself or to even address the problem. But the act of recognition and self-recognition is key to this process of change, not something that someone can come down from the top and give you.
Yeah, and Freire says it several different ways, essentially saying, the starting point for organizing the program content of education or political action must be the present existential concrete situation reflecting the aspirations of the people. It also says the revolutionary's role is to liberate and be liberated with the people, not win them over. It says that essentially winning them over that's the language of the oppressor, and that the point isn't to win them over, but in raising consciousness together, we better understand and can act on the world, and that will make a better world. Like, the reason why we have these fears of people, manipulating and doing all these bad things if we allow them to be a part of the discourse of the dialogue is a direct result of those myths that are born into us, the hegemonic thinking. There's, obviously probably some sort of neurological component for some folks, and a variety of other things. But the primary thing for winning liberation is the recognition of the contradictions between the explanations that we have for the world and the reality of the world. And we love to do that in science, but for some reason, when it comes to social situations or politics, it's heresy, essentially, to really bring these into the spotlight and to actually look at them from an analytical perspective in an attempt at dialogue to reach a better understanding, rather than to convince the person you're discussing it with that you're right and they're wrong. Those are kind of different things, and the top down aspect of it. So when you're working with people that you would identify as allies, the programmatic and the top down kind of aspect is ineffective. Freire goes on to kind of talk about how the concrete situations and the realities that the people face may surprise you or may not be what you expect. And if you go in there without consulting with the people first, then you can end up working against yourself. And so it's very important in the dialogical framework that you have faith in people to be able to get there, but that it's not a blind faith. I think if I can find the quote here quickly, it says it's how his faith, however, is not naive. The dialogical man is critical and knows that although it is within the power of humans to create and transform in a concrete situation of within the power of humans to create and transform in a concrete situation of alienation, individuals may be impaired in their use of that power. And so that's what Wendy was mentioning, essentially, about that when the faith isn't blind, and that you have to recognize that there will be impediments and barriers between having that dialogue, and that the important thing is to try and remove those impediments and barriers rather than to hunker down in camps and to toss invective at each other, but to just clearly, or to make it clear also my other point, that doesn't mean to coddle white supremacists.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, we got to have a caveat there. Like, there also is a protective element where because I don't think, personally speaking, I'd never have read their Freire to say, like, but go hang out with white supremacists and be friends with, like, it's not about that. It's not quite the message he's trying to push. You have to protect yourself from the oppressor too.
Just quickly, if you're just getting into this like I am, my advice, as tempered as it would be focus on those that you already identify as allies. Mm-hmm. This is going to, like, you're going to realize quickly how hard this is with people that you thought agreed with you. And it's like, work there first before you bother to try and bring along those that are, might have a Nazi or a Confederate flag because they're, like, it's about heritage. Mm-hmm. Like, don't worry about those folks right now. In building this movement, the people that you need right now are the people that are allegedly support all the things that you do, but they're essentially how MLK Jr. referred to as the white moderate.
Yes, there are moments. I mean, yeah, I think that there's some times where your perceived allies are that alliance or that allyship is porous, right? It has holes. It has moments too where you're like, oh, okay, but you have more of a solid in that kind of alliance than you do in an alliance that basically is a whole, right? Like there's not going to go ahead.
Say when you pick one issue like anti-war and then you ignore what that anti-war stance would actually bring in from their side.
Right. And also the ways that members of a movement can be threatened by other members of a movement rather directly. You have to also think about protecting yourself and protecting the people within a group. Like you know what I mean? You don't want to put people in a position where they're not only defending against violence from larger systemic forms of oppression, but they're also defending against violence directly in their organization. I mean, that's kind of complicated. But I do think that, just to give people reference points, by the way, what we were just talking about is around pages 104, when he's talking about consciousness and talking about situationality and also understandings of reality. All of that's on around page 105 to 110. So anyone who's reading the original, or the version of the book that we included on the Patreon, just so you know where we sort of are. And then also furthering what you were saying, Richard, I think that this particular chapter gives very good examples of how to engage in what we nowadays call, like horizontal organizing without letting things spiral out of control. Because sometimes, even in cases of horizontal organizing, we see people sort of emerging as quote unquote leaders, or we have sort of a hierarchy, a creation of a hierarchy within these groups. And I think that his discussion in this chapter does a very good job about keeping the need for these kinds of movements to remain horizontal in mind. So he gives an example of people who are conducting research and the better way to do that. So instead of coming into a community that you've never been engaged with, you don't know anything about, and saying, this is how it's going to be, everyone. He gives the example of, you need to send people to do research. You need to live in this place for, and he means this, by the way, not necessarily literally, like you need to go live in a place for 3 years before you start working and doing organizing there, but that you do need to have familiarity with the people that you're working with. You have to have an understanding of the conditions they face. You have to understand the ways that you are a part of reinforcing some of these conditions. He talks about the need as well to have constant dialogue with members of the community, which is something that I think some organizers and political organizers forget. But there has to be engagement, constant listening, constant dialogue, and constant research as well. And not research in a way where you see people as objects, or where you see people's communities as like points of data, but where you understand the ways that these people are impacted by what's happening to them in their communities, and the ways that they're impacted by these structural issues. It's not just a matter of, like, okay, there are poor people, that's sad, and they have to deal with XYZ, but also understanding how they have internalized it, how they experience it, and also how they express what solutions will be best for them. That's what I took away, at least, of what he meant when he talked about research in this particular chapter.
Yeah, and this particular chapter, for me, this was what I found the most applicable, both currently, and then also it just it seemed to really resonate with me. And there's some phrases that, or some terms that he uses that I want to go over a little bit at some point. But what I really stuck out to me was in that organizing section. This really spoke to me in that it takes a mutual trust and understanding of what you're trying to do. And like, I think you mentioned how the people can't be objectified and looked at as numbers and statistics. And I think a lot of that has to do very much with the actual research method. And I think a lot of what Freire talks about and describes in this research has later been integrated into a lot of sociological research, particularly with rarely contacted communities, in order to try to identify their culture rather than to give a Western identification of a forward culture kind of thing. And so a lot of those principles or ideas can be used for, an organizer who wants to work in a community that they aren't personally familiar with. Because it's important that if you want to work with a community, and rather than come in and deposit information into them, that you have to find out what they are after. And part of that is really lined out in this chapter. And without being too systematic, as Freire tried to avoid, I just wanted to kind of relay some of the important parts of that I got out of it.
I mean, the cool part about this chapter is that there's a lot of stuff, I think, in the second half of chapter 3, where he really does lay out how you should conduct research, which unfortunately a lot of people don't. They should do more of, but they don't. And I think that in addition, like I said, in addition to it being very, very instructive for how to conduct research, it's also very instructive on how to engage in local organizing, and also just in how to have normal human relationships.
Yeah, I was gonna say I could use more of this online. It's hard for me to maintain that kind of decorum, but there's a lot of good stuff on here for just interacting with other human beings.
Right, like how to listen properly, how to gather information and learn from others, how to reflect, how to properly address their concerns. I mean, it also, I think, like I said, he focuses so much on dialogue, but I think, once again, as we've seen in the previous chapters, he uses this chapter to then take what he taught us, basically, and put it into practice, and to show how dialogue is sort of a metaphor for this much larger process of interacting with others. So it's not just about the word, it's not just about the discussions, the verbal, but it's also about your actions and your behavior in these spaces. And so he says, for example, he's talking about people paying attention, investigating a particular community. And he says, during this decoding stage, I'm on page, what page am I on? I'm on page 111, I think this is. But he says, during the decoding stage, the investigators observe certain moments of the life of the area, sometimes directly, sometimes by means of informal conversations with the inhabitants. They register everything in their notebooks, including apparently unimportant items, the way people talk, their style of life, their behavior at church and at work. They record the idiom of the people, their expressions, their vocabulary, and their syntax, not their incorrect pronunciation, but rather the way they construct their thought. And like, that's so important. I mean, just because I think sometimes people are dismissed because they're not seen as formally educated, or they're not understood as, oh, you haven't held this job, you haven't held that job, and so whatever you say doesn't matter. Or perhaps this is another thing that happens as well. People will be saying something very important, like super important, but it may not be expressed in the terminology that's correct, right? It may sometimes use terminology that's incorrect, terminology that's not in fashion anymore, or that's sometimes deemed as politically incorrect. But at the heart of what they're trying to say, there is significance that sometimes people dismiss because it's not put in the quote unquote right language. You know what I mean? And so I think that is, and that just speaks to larger problems of classism, racism, forms of structural power that we've been taught to internalize and believe in. And so, yeah, I think that this section of the chapter, even though it is very much about, like actual research, and how to conduct, an academic thematic investigation, it's also important that we can try to apply these things in our everyday interactions with others who may not have, or who also, I'm sorry, I was going to say who may not have the same formal instruction or level of instruction of us, but also people who are quote unquote higher than us and how they engage with us, right? Like if I'm speaking to a tenured professor and he or she is talking to me and I'm trying to express something, but I'm not being taken seriously because I'm not a formal academic yet, or I'm, fill in the blank, I'm a woman, I'm a Black woman, whatever. There are certain things that disrupt our ability to understand people that go back to very old biases. And we have to try to break down some of that stuff and really listen. And I think that this part of the book really does a good job in showing people, teaching people how to do that.
Wendy's just reminded me that I'm still working on flushing out my abolish college position, but this is definitely part of it. In that, it's like I feel like the systematic problems within higher education are just as pervasive as any other institution that we would advocate the abolition of. And so that doesn't mean, and the abolition of college doesn't mean no higher education. It means that we need higher education that serves the people. And right now we have an oppressive institution that reinforces oppressive tendencies and behaviors. And like as Wendy mentioned, is like if I don't have the right letters after my name and I go up to a person with the right letters after their name, it already colors the type of dialogue we can have. And everything about all of these systems reinforces the oppressive banking model rather than a dialogical interactive learning model, which is the only way towards liberation. And so I see them acting in opposition.
Oh yeah. Or I've heard, for example, I've heard a parallel of this to the Democratic Party, but I've also heard, that academia is where radicals go to die, basically, or where radicalism goes to die. And it's as someone who's like, I'm working on my PhD, and I definitely see how we are taught to not, we're basically discouraged from being radical in many, many ways that I feel like we should have a separate episode on altogether. Because there's a lot to say about that. But yeah, it's definitely true. And I appreciate what you said. And I think that there does need to be a full overhaul, if not total breakdown, and start from scratch with regard to the education system in this country, including at its highest levels, because it's got some issues for sure.
Yeah. And to that effect, one of the main things that I think Freire mentions in the kind of programmatic where he programmatically lays out what this research looks like, and it starts around page 110 and goes on through till about 120. But so I'm going to do some summarizing here. But one of the main ones is the first contact. So you're an organizer, for prison abolition or for whatever it may be. And a lot of organizers already know this, and if with any luck, some of them are listening. So forgive me for any mistakes I make in kind of trying to articulate this, but this is kind of what I pulled out of the description that Freire gives us, is to get an agreement from the community to have an informal meeting to just kind of discuss what you're there for.
Mm-hmm.
And in this process, page 108, it just as the educator may not elaborate a program to present to the people, neither may the investigator elaborate itineraries for researching the thematic universe, starting from points which they have predetermined. So what this means is that, you're coming in, it's not, hey, I want to get you to vote for Bernie Sanders, or I want to get you to, to do this thing. It's like, I want to research about, how prison abolition is impacting your community. And that's just kind of a starting point. And as he goes on to kind of lay out that in investigating that, we're going to come across other themes and other, patterns that are going to want to be investigated. And that's the real work, is going into a community and investigating those themes within that community and how they relate to them, so that you can better communicate what you see in the world, and that you two can have a dialogue with the world as it is, being a mediator between you,
Mm-hmm.
rather than referencing some text and saying, no, I know this is true because I read it here, and if you don't know or recognize it, it's because you haven't read it and don't realize it too. And part of the disappointing part for me for chapter 3 was, this sounds like a lot of work, not fun, very frustrating. And like all the things is like, a guillotine sounds way, way, way easier. Like, and so like, but Freire kind of mentions is like that we can't take on the tools of the oppressor to achieve liberation.
Mm-hmm.
Whether that's sloganizing, whether that's dictating, or whatever it may be. And I think he mentions Lenin positively several times, but I feel like there's some criticism of later realizations of the Russian Revolution, in that essentially that it's critically important to maintain the communication with the people, and that when revolutionary leaders lose that connection to the people, they lose their revolutionary identity, and the revolution itself kind of loses its realness, its authenticity. And
Right.
I think that's very important. So if whatever it is, whatever revolutionary act one is undertaking, if the idea is to rally support from the masses, the only way to do that is to relate to the masses in the way that they relate to the world. That doesn't mean, it's like, oh, I have to coddle a white supremacist. It means you have to understand that why this person who's articulating their class struggle in racist terms, why they're doing that, and get them to look into why they're doing that. And that's the goal, is like, even if you can't get them to recognize that it's wrong, if they can, the more they critically analyze the structures and the thought processes that lead them to these things, the more likely they are to be able to break free of them. And that's for all of us, whatever it is, whether that's being whether that's for, I know some self-proclaimed socialists, the Venezuela issue made them kind of question how much they were ready to toe the socialist mass line. And I think when you look at the situation from the perspective of those in the communities, and I'm not talking about white Venezuelans on Twitter, but the marginalized people in Venezuela, and that are historically marginalized people in Venezuela, the support for Maduro is clear. Like, and even if not directly for Maduro, for the U.S. to stay out, and what Guaido did was unacceptable. And so, like, I don't want to digress. I'm sorry. The main thing is that you have to engage with people, and if you're not engaged with the people, then you should be more comfortable with either the mass line or staying quiet.
Mm-hmm.
Like, because there are people that put work and time into an effort into being aware and knowledgeable on these issues, and they've done the work that should give you the comfort to either support the same rhetoric, or to stay quiet, or at least to do the critical thinking yourself. Like, and any sort of critical analysis of any of these situations, be it the banking industry, be it international intervention, be it racism in America. If you do a genuine critical analysis, as Freire kind of presents to us here, it's almost certain that you'll arrive at a new conclusion than the one that society has left you with.
I think also, like, just looking directly at Freire's words, if you're on page 110 at the very bottom, he's talking again about the investigators, and he says, the investigators begin their own visits to the area, never forcing themselves, but acting as sympathetic observers with an attitude of understanding towards what they see. And then he says, while it's normal for investigators to come to an area with values that influence their perceptions, this does not mean that they may transform the thematic investigation into a means of imposing these values. And I think, that's one of the issues that I have also had just in general of reporting, period. I think a lot of people who do research in some areas or who do journalism in some areas, they go into a place or a situation with a specific idea and they don't ever listen. They just stick to that idea. They try to find proof of that idea and then they leave with the same idea. They don't necessarily go into a space listening. They don't go into a space trying to understand and come to terms with what these people are experiencing and saying. And I think that is something that we saw a lot of, and we see a lot of in reporting on international issues, because what a lot of American mainstream reporters will do is they say, okay, there's this particular problem. I'm going to go to a place. I'm going to look for that same problem. I'm going to find people who will speak to me, who agree with me on this problem, and then I'm going to leave. I'm going to parachute in and I'm going to jump out, right? I'm going to get airlifted out. And I think that kind of, he warns against that. And this is not just one particular, it's not just about mainstream. I think there are also leftist outlets that do the same thing, unfortunately. And I think we have to have a better sense of, or we have to sort of enforce better listening skills on ourselves, right? Instead of trying to enforce ideas upon others, we have to be able to listen. And we have to also, I would say one last thing, and then we can keep going. I have to say that we also have to remember that populations are diverse. There are a whole lot of different perspectives. And Black people don't agree with everything among each other. Every Black person may have a different opinion about a specific issue. Every Venezuelan may have a different opinion on a different issue. You want to get an understanding of what the majority think, sure, but there are all sorts of degrees of nuance and variation within that. And so we have to be mindful of that whenever we make sweeping assessments. Because if we make sweeping assessments, it often means, and especially those that are sort of predetermined, right? If we decide before we talk to people what they think, then that's really, really bad. And it's literally against what he's saying to do. It's literally the opposite of dialogue, and so it's really important that we keep that in mind. I want to, if we can, keep going and then go to chapter 4, because we haven't gotten to chapter 4 yet. There's so much good stuff in chapter 3. I just want to say quickly, the rest of chapter 3 it basically just talks about the investigators' situation and how to conduct research, discussion, community work. He gives a few more examples of things that happened with investigators. He also does a breakdown of several terms that he uses and has some charts in this chapter, which is also kind of cool to check out if you have a chance and if you have this version. But just, I didn't know if there was something else that you wanted to go into with this one before we go on to chapter 4, but I wanted to make sure that we get chapter 4 in before we forget it.
Before it becomes try and turn it into a 4-parter. Absolutely. So I just wanted to mention, like, some of the words that people are going to want to focus in on. Contradictions. Pay attention to when Freire talks about contradictions, because that's going to be fundamental towards decoding the unique living code, which is how he describes the investigative process, essentially. That when you look at it as, he uses the word problem, but I would rather use situation to better understand that then these challenges become less burdensome and more kind of like, I don't want to gamify the situation, but more of it makes a game challenging versus just going through, like, you see them more as challenges than impassable burdens, I guess to say, or impassable or being impassable. And so I think that that's really important. And then that's also where people can spark their critical consciousness. A conversation about why a particular hairstyle is unacceptable, or why it's unacceptable for that person to be that man to be wearing pink or whatever, can spur a conversation that gets people to analyze the deeper assumptions and myths that they've accepted that help them form these ideas and positions that are so counterproductive towards liberation, even their own. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I just wanted to really pull from chapter 3 is that Freire says that humans are because we are in a situation, and that, like, he mentions the faith to remake the world, and sometimes it's hard to imagine just how some kind of easy it is for the world to just dramatically change without people even realizing something's completely different, and then just adding that to this is how it's always been. I mentioned the Man in Pink. That was a marketing campaign that really took off in the 40s, 50s, 60s. Like, prior to 1940, it was not, pink was often seen as a masculine color. And so, like, it was like seen as a lighter red, and red was already masculinized. So and so, like, now we have these elaborate gender reveal ceremonies about the colors that signify a sex, and that's something that we just created within the lifetime of people that are still alive. And you can even ask some of the people that lived through it about it, and they have adopted the idea that it's always been that way, even though they were alive before it was that way. And so when we look at the challenges that we face in organizing and in changing the world and making the world into what we'd like it to be, we can't limit ourselves to the naysayers who say, oh, well, you can never overcome the human greed, or you can never overcome corruption, or you can never overcome these obstacles, because it's simply not true. It's like the entire paradigms can shift in a generation if the effort is made. And like, that was a bourgeoisie marketing effort, but a real revolutionary effort to change the way that we see the world, and our ability to remake it can happen in the time frame that I see as necessary as a result of climate change. But that's what I'll leave with chapter 3.
I just wanted to add quickly too, to help with this. The term problem. So in this particular case, it's like an old school way of saying situation, actually. And you'll see a lot of essays and stuff that are written, for example, W.E.B. Du Bois's essay on the Negro problem, right? You'll see also things like Marx and others talking about the Jewish problem. So it's not so much that it's leftover like scientific experiment language too. And sociological study language. So, when you have a problem, it just means a question or an issue that you want to better understand, if not resolve in some cases, or you conduct research to better understand and resolve. So yeah, for those reading it, he doesn't mean and like Du Bois and Marx and others don't mean that these people are problems, right? Just to clarify that. But I'm glad you brought it up, because I think it needs a little bit of clarification. But instead, that it is just a question. It just means question or issue. And then he talks about how to further understand that question or issue, and how to solve in this case, the problems that are posed to communities on account of their position in the world. So like if they're Black, if they're Jewish, if they're poor, whatever, fill in the blank. So transitioning to chapter 4, we have in chapter 4 something that, again, we were hinting at a little bit, but we see here a breakdown, again, of more terms. In this case, though, it's a breakdown of a very strong term that a lot of people use, and that I sometimes am not sure that we do enough talking about in I guess activist circles or in organizing, what this term means. But the idea of praxis, that's what the bulk of this chapter is about. And he talks about, this is also where we see a lot more charts and things like that. It gets really, really technical, so just be prepared for that. But he does talk about, again, sort of a breakdown of what dialogue is, He has a breakdown of how to put dialogue into practice, and he talks about what praxis means as well. And he also starts to get into a lot of historical references that we can go into briefly at some point. But this chapter also, which again, kind of, I'm like, why didn't you do this in the beginning? But this chapter also is technical to the sense that it has subject headings, which is very helpful, actually. Like, why didn't you have it, excuse me, in the rest of the book? But Richard and I are going to go into a little bit of what he says in each of those subheadings for chapter 4. So I'll just start off by saying briefly that this definition that he opens with about, and sort of I guess, like, basically you see the definition of praxis unfold throughout the chapter, which is helpful because he tells us what it means, and then he keeps telling us over and over in different ways. Again, a practice of his that he has throughout the book. So I want to talk about that, and then we can keep going from there. So praxis, what does it mean? What is it? Why is it important? And he says on the very first part of this chapter that human activity consists of action and reflection. It is praxis. It is transformation of the world. And as praxis, it requires theory to illuminate it. Human activity is theory and practice. It is reflection and action. It cannot be reduced to either verbalism or activism. And when he says activism, he means like sort of the guise of activism. It's not like when we talk about activism nowadays. He doesn't mean that like activism is bad. He's saying that activism in the sense where it's just sort of posturing. It's the pretension of an act, but not the actual act. Just like verbalism is empty words and not the actual use of dialogue.
It's like thoughtless action and actionless thoughts. Like,
yep.
that's how I interpreted it.
That's much clearer. Say that again. Say it. I like it. Say it again.
Or say, well, it was thoughtless action and actionless thoughts.
We want to avoid that.
Yeah, those are the two extremes, and so like that's, and I think various political movements and factions have, whatever, treaded along that line and stumbled across both sides. And I think it's a critical point of reflection. I think one of the things that Freire points out is that, in the whole not prognosticating from on high, that it's important that we're critical of the takes that we engage with, that we don't just accept them on whole as an absolute reflection of reality, but as a genuine reflection of that person's experience. And to that effect, in identifying the foundation of praxis, he does a lot of kind of animal theorizing, which is kind of, I feel like, out of the realm. I think it's building off of philosophical work that delineated animals and humans throughout the time, and was based on a lot of the thinkers of the time and previous. And we're not going to really touch that, but I think he does plenty well in chapter 1 and 2 without the whole animal structures or the animalization of recognizing why making and understanding the world is a human function, whether it's uniquely human or not, is rather less important than that it is definitively a human action that needs to be a part of being human. And so that any system or action that interferes with that is interfering with our humanity. And that's kind of where he articulates the love of the necrophilic, that by supporting any of those types of actions or systems, it's a support of the death of humans, of their humanity.
I like also that he seems to be, as you hinted at this earlier, but he's like down with Lenin, which is kind of interesting and well timed once again. But I like that he incorporates Leninist thought in this work quite a bit, actually, and Marx too. We've already talked about this, but it's just really important, and I think it might encourage some people to go and reread some of this stuff, or to read it for the first time and to think about how he applied it so well, which I personally appreciate. But I like the part that he includes here to kind of show the Leninist version of what he said earlier about praxis and action, avoiding the prospect of verbalism and activism in this very technical sense. But he quotes Lenin saying from his work, What is to be Done? Quote, without a revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement. It means that a revolution is achieved with neither verbalism nor activism, but rather praxis, again, as he says, with reflection and action. But then he goes on to say, the revolutionary effort to transform these structures radically cannot designate its leaders as its thinkers and the oppressed as mere doers. And this I really felt because I'm sick and tired of seeing what feels like a kind of, let this particular group do the thought and all the speaking on an issue, and then have these other people go and canvas and have these other people go and like put bumper stickers on their cars, but not really engage in the leadership positions and not really have them engage in more, decision-making positions. And so I just think it's so important, like, to see this written down in written form and say, okay, there are people thinking about these things, or were people thinking about these things long before any of us experienced them in the present. And so we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Like we can see this
Yes.
information here. People have experienced it before. You're not imagining things. Like, this is a continuous problem, and we have to figure out a way to address it and change things.
Yeah, and these septo and octogenarians should know better, because like, they were learning, and like, I mean, there's people that were in the process of learning when these ideas were being spread, and they chose a side, and it wasn't this side.
Mm-hmm. And like you said, people forget that, I think what you mentioned about revolutions and what you're referring to Freire, but how when he talks about, sometimes revolutionary leaders can mess up. Sometimes they lose sight of their initial goals. Sometimes they start with goals that are not about liberation. They may seem to be about liberation, but they're not truly about liberation because they never fully listened to the people that they were meant to serve, right? And so, yeah, I think that he goes on, actually, he talks about this on the next page, so I should just read it. But he says, quote, revolutionary leaders, this is on 127, revolutionary leaders who do not act dialogically in their relations with the people either have retained characteristics of the dominator and are not truly revolutionary, or they are totally misguided in their conception of their role and prisoners of their own sectarianism and are equally non-revolutionary, which, like, damn, like, I think that's but I mean, it sounds like I'm joking, but like, it's so important for us to remember that. And when I say for us to remember that, I don't mean that like everyone's going to be Che Guevara, right? Like, not everyone's going to be out leading a revolution, but just, again, in everything that we do in our lives, remember what our purpose was. Remember why we started to do it. Many of us went into our jobs and things like that with hope to help people, right? And we have to keep sight of like why we're doing something. We cannot lose sight of that. And not just to help people, but then to change the systems that oppress us, right? Not to have this turn into something that is about fame, or that's about, I want to have the most clicks on Twitter, or I want to be, I think we were talking about this before, but like the prospect of grifting, we see so many of these things that seem revolutionary, but often are flawed severely because they don't start from a good place and they don't end in a good place. So people cannot lose sight of this stuff.
I really love when like I'm like waiting to quote something once you finish, and then that you end with the quote that I was gonna do.
I'm sorry.
No. It just means that we were on the same page, and like, yeah. I enjoy
literally
that.
On the same page.
Yes. But I think it's really important, and when by reading this text, like, for me, before reading this text, sometimes I, get confronted with things that, like, on the surface seem like they don't match up with the worldview projected by the socialist general view, or by Marx, or any of that type of stuff. It doesn't seem to line up, but I can't quite put my finger on it. I feel like this is a very succinct way to kind of identify some of those issues. Is like, if a revolutionary leader is not acting dialogically in their relationships with the people, at least even in their immediate circle, then you can be almost sure that they've retained characteristics of the dominator and are likely pursuing the goal of being the new oppressor rather than liberation for themselves or for anybody else. And it's whether that's their intention or not. When you don't act dialogically, that's the direction you're heading. And so as Freire mentioned earlier in chapter 3 about the faith and trust in the people to be able to change and remake the world, when you're doing this, when you're failing to act dialogically, that demonstrates and manifests in exactly the ways as Freire identifies, and we've seen that. We can look at how that's happened since Freire wrote this in a variety of movements throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and into today.
I would just say, I'm
go
sorry, go ahead. No, I would just say the only thing that's missing for me is like I mean, he talks about military coups later on, but I feel like the only thing missing is like the constant fight against enemies that revolutionary leaders are also plagued with, and how to deal with that and still be liberatory, I think is a challenge. So like if you're constantly facing internal strife, if you're internal meaning like you're within your administration, if you're facing sanctions, if you're facing war constantly, like if you're looking down the barrel of a gun, is it possible to still be revolutionary in the same way? I mean, this is not a question I need an answer to. I'm just saying it's something to consider as well.
Well, it's definitely something to think about, especially in the context. I mean, like you're more familiar than myself, probably many of the listeners, about the situation in which Freire was writing this text, and like the backlash that he faced, and the degree, and then also like Che and his work and his organizing and the frustrations that he faced in some of the movements when he arrived, and so on and so forth, which I think Freire actually mentions in here later as well. But that it's not easy, and it's like when there's imperial forces acting on it, it has a different tint, or strong fascist forces internally, changes the dynamic. And so I think Freire is definitely, I feel like Freire is more applicable to the situation in the U.S. than perhaps the mini manual for guerrillas. And I also think that these are somewhat identifiable factions within socialist movements today, in that this is not quite into democratic socialism. I would still place this in the socialist sphere, as in socialism with my limited understanding and knowledge. But it's still in the revolutionary socialism category, but it's not the more aggressive, violent, which I think the mini manual makes very good arguments for, considering the conditions. And so I think these are the type of dialogues that are going to be necessary moving forward in a revolution, in a U.S. revolution, to identify what are the effective methods, recognizing the world as a mediator rather than the myths that we've been convinced about the world.
That's a really good point, and I think one we should consider, because obviously Marighella was still in Brazil during the dictatorship, and was murdered by dictatorial forces. Not to say that Freire wasn't. Freire was also there. He was arrested. He had to deal with a lot of stuff. But it's interesting when you compare their responses, even though they're writing around the same time, they're dealing with similar challenges, in the sense that they're both being hunted down by the military dictatorship, but their response to it is very different. And it makes me also wonder, what part of Freire's upbringing also informed that. He didn't come from a poor family. They weren't initially poor. They became poor over time. But how that changes his response. Also, what does it mean to be, for example, because Freire is a white man, which we haven't really talked about his race at all. But in Brazil, for sure, he's considered white. He's not considered white as much outside of Brazil, at least in the United States, just because he's Latino. But he is white in Brazil, and white for all intents and purposes, but grew up in an area that was, mixed racially and whatnot, worked among a variety of people race-wise, whereas Marighella was identifiably of color. Again, in Brazil, he wasn't considered Black, but he wasn't considered white either. He's, a mixed race person. So how that also may have changed his response in some ways, how that also changed the way he was targeted. He was an outright communist. There's just certain things that I think definitely make their experiences different, but also makes it worth our thinking about maybe why those, why they have these different responses and how they're both important, but can be thought of as useful in different contexts in different ways.
And perhaps why, they had the fates that they did at the government hands. Like that there may be a relationship there, and that like what that means to revolutionaries in the U.S.
That's a good point.
And so, like that to me stuck out. And I guess with that, I don't know if there was some more from before the headings start that you wanted to touch on.
No, I just think that the only other part really quickly is when he starts going into what happens under a coup. This is just kind of fun to read. But I think that his breakdown on page 128 about the way dialogue does not function in a coup and why it's important for us to distinguish between a revolution that's authentic and a coup. So he says, for example, one thing that makes them very different is, quote, one does not expect dialogue from a coup, only deceit in order to achieve, quote unquote, legitimacy, or force in order to repress. Sooner or later, a true revolution must initiate a courageous dialogue with the people. So we already sort of mentioned that, but it's just sort of interesting to think about the ways that under oppression and under oppressive political states, dialogue is subbed for violence, repression, silencing, and deceit under the guise of legitimacy, right? Because one of the things that you see quite often with coups that happened in the 60s and 70s throughout Latin America, as they would say, we're taking over to control, we're taking over to create order, right? It was always about order. It was always about righting things that had become too chaotic. Basically, too many people are trying to demand their rights. This is making things too crazy. We've got to stop this. We need to bring back order. And this is something that you see over and over and over and over and over. And that's sort of the false sense of legitimacy that they have to parade in on. And what's really interesting, and why he's saying this as a Brazilian, is that in the case of the military coup in 1964 in Brazil, they called it a revolution. So the military generals said that it was a revolution. And so this is why he's specifically saying a real revolution doesn't rely on this BS to try to get into power. So just to give a little bit of historical background, that's what he's talking about here specifically.
I think it's important, especially in light of what we were just discussing, to bring that to light, that he is making a confrontational statement in that directly towards his material conditions as they were at that moment. Not
yes.
Like it's and its applicability to that we can see the parallels between now and today is beyond coincidence, but it reflects a pattern that Freire was identifying, and that Marx helped identify, and that many other people have seen and helped write on and identify and articulate. And there are a variety of pathways to act in opposition to those. And I think the next part, where the headings are, Freire kind of gives us a bit of, it's sort of like not quite game theory, but it's just kind of an idea of what is actually happening, kind of themes that really articulate what's transpiring. The first one is conquest.
We're on page 138 where he starts with the subheading. So go ahead.
And what I really liked about these subheadings and how he mentions it is basically he gives you, this is the anti-dialogical pathway and this is the dialogical pathway, and they are exclusive. Like you're either pursuing one or the other at any given moment and in any given action. And if they reflect those of the oppressor, that is anti-dialogical, and that is not going to lead us to liberation. And so being able to identify what those are and how they're happening and when they're happening, and see those themes either at the larger level in international affairs, or even at the local or even interpersonal level, helps us identify when our either internal oppressors or oppressions are acting, or we're buying into the myths that we have been taught, or we can see in other people where there's a genuine emotion there that's real and valid, and a sincere reaction to the negative consequences of capitalism, but they're reconciling and identifying it in a way that doesn't actually capture what's happening. And so helping people to be able to do that is more important than getting them to see it how you see it. Because I think the overarching theme is that when we do that, we see things much more similarly than we would than we do currently.
And this part is so great because, I mean, these subheading parts are so great because what he does is it just feels so relevant. Like, I know I've been saying that the whole time, but everything I read in this, I'm like, yeah, here's an example of that. Here's an example of this, on page 139 at the bottom of the section of Conquest, he says, he starts talking about myths and the types of myths that oppressors deposit into us, quite literally, to preserve the status quo, he says. For example, the myth that the oppressive order is a free society, the myth that all persons are free to work wherever they wish, that if they don't like their boss, they can leave him and look for another job, the myth that this order respects human rights and is therefore worthy of esteem, the myth that anyone who is industrious can become an entrepreneur, or worse yet, that the myth that the street vendor is as much an entrepreneur as the owner of a large factory. Like, all of these things that we're told repeatedly in the United States. I mean, he's just talking about the Brazilian context, but I felt this so much because I thought, we're talking today about humanitarianism through war, or freedom through oppression, or, like, everyone can make it. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, don't be lazy, this. And it's like, are you kidding me? Like, the difference between someone like me and you and Bezos is ginormous, exponential, and yet we're brainwashed into thinking that, if you just work hard enough, if you work hard like Jeff Bezos, you can be just like him one day.
Yeah,
but
if I open a coffee stand, then we're both entrepreneurs. And when they're talking about, small business, they're really talking about both of us.
Right. Yeah, like, it's just kind of interesting that, this stuff it's interesting, but it's also, I guess, on the same side, kind of depressing that we're still having these conversations. Like, we're still here,
I feel like for a lot of Black people that have studied the history of slavery and so on and so forth, I feel like for me, it was a lot of the house slave mentality of, as long as I can get a comfortable living, then it's not hard for me to, be the one to be like, don't mess this up for us, the ones that are inside the house. Don't you feel Negroes go around and start doing wild and out, make master mad and kick us all out. Like, that's I see that in capitalism and in this text and in everywhere. It's just like, you believe these myths, and then people, if you contradict those myths, there's a mutual interest between the oppressor and the oppressed, with too much oppressor left in them to shout down the person that's trying to free them and or trying to help see liberation.
Oh, and speaking of myths, we should have a separate reading about the false dichotomy between house and field slaves on a separate day, because that's also a myth.
Yeah, that's fair too.
For another day. But yeah, there were a lot of people who were house slaves who led revolutions, and a lot of people who were oppressed just in different ways, like very extremely oppressed, but in different ways. I understand your point insofar as it's a
general
metaphor.
Character. Yeah.
Like, but there's like a lot of there's been a lot of like cool work done recently to talk about what house slaves dealt with and how they responded to it. That's but worth maybe a discussion on another day.
Yeah, I do think it's very important in general towards a revolutionary movement, understanding how those that are in privileged positions can act on behalf of those in less in all of that. And I think that's also important to Freire's work. And understanding it better is, like I said, I should have forewarned that my understanding is still limited and very, colonized.
Oh no, this is not about you, by the way. I'm not trying to be like, Richard, you don't know what you're talking about. I mean, in the sense that, like, we hear this a lot, right? I think it's a kind of phrasing that we're used to hearing about the house slaves versus the field slaves. And there was a lot of overlap and people working together and a lot of stuff happening, people using their position in the house, which, by the way, was not a cakewalk for a lot of people, especially women and children, just to be frank, really. Dealing with rape, sexual assault, and physical abuse on a regular, like a very direct, regular basis. So, it's a little bit, there's a little bit more nuance to be had in that discussion, but I think that phrasing is useful insofar as if we base it on the assumptions that we have about what happened during slavery, then yes. On that note, the next section is divide and rule, which is useful in this case because we're talking about slavery. But yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh no, I just like I guess the myths that he lays out, he goes on to lay out some more that are just so ingrained and hegemonic in Western society today. It's hard to imagine that somebody pointed out that they were myths then, and that there's not really a strong counter argument to those myths. A lot of them are just based off of a group of people shouting you down and calling you mad for not agreeing with what everybody else in the room accepts as reality.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and that's one of the things I found the more that I've dove in, especially particularly with liberals and supposed people that are on the same side, is that when you dig into their perspectives and their positions on these things, they're either vacuous and devoid of an actual worldview and based mostly on just remaining close to what they view as the center, or are actually, very capitalistic, fascist, and right-leaning in their base assumptions about how society works. Police is a good example about the fear of there not being police, as if society didn't have police as we know it, or incarceration as we know it, for a long time, and that like what 400 years of incarceration reform has got us is that we've gone from incarceration primarily being somewhere where you kept somebody until you killed them to being someplace where you work somebody until they die. That's what 400 years of prison reform has gotten us. And so I think that's why a lot of people take the position of abolition and so on and so forth, and that like these oppressive realities are so enormous and so hegemonic that the idea that it doesn't have to be this way is seems an insurmountable task to bring somebody along to. And that's why enlightening or raising consciousness is much easier than trying to give a statistical analysis about why prisons aren't effective. It's like you can do that supplementary, but it's not going to, we actually done research. There's been research done on this, so that you can present people with contrary information, and rather than change their perspective, it actually hardens their perspective.
That's depressing.
Yeah.
Going back really quickly to the text, just wanted to, I mean, this one is again sort of a given. Most people know what it means to say divide and rule, or divide and conquer, as we've heard. But he gives some examples here that I just still think are really applicable, both throughout history and obviously to our present. One of the big ones that I liked that he spoke about, or appreciated that he spoke about, is the fact of like the ways that oppressors can weaken oppressed people and make them feel like they're alone. He says they weaken the oppressed still further to isolate them, to create and deepen rifts among them. This is done by various means. And he talks about the different ways that the government is involved with making it seem like they're helping people when in actuality they are still harming people. I also think, again, like so useful the way he criticizes community development projects, and the problems that he sees in these, the way that they actually can exacerbate alienation on behalf of certain members of that community. I also think one of the things that stood out to me as well is like so relevant is the sort of plucking of leaders within the community, turning them into leaders, putting them in positions of power, and then basically forcing them, if not encouraging them, to assert control in a way that's oppressive on the community, even though they also still are being oppressed. So it's this like ladder, or this hierarchy basically of oppression. That I also one last thing about this section, I also appreciated that he talked about class conflict rather bluntly. He's like, this is something that the prospect of class conflict is something that oppressors don't want to address. They don't want to think about. It scares them. And they don't want to, they constantly try to sort of put out the idea that they're not the oppressors. Like, don't go after, basically don't turn me to the guillotine, like that's the point of it. But ultimately it's this constant sort of sloughing off of responsibility for the oppression that they enact upon others, which is something we see a lot of. No one wants to be poor, but you'll see people who are rich who like pretend that they're not doing so great in order to sort of portray themselves as also oppressed or marginalized in some way, when in actuality they are they are exhibiting extreme cases of, or extreme versions of power and exerting
not a
those forms of
billionaire.
power.
I'm not a billionaire pig. I'm a person of means.
Right. Oh.
The quotes that stuck it out for me were on page 143. Freire says, "The oppressors do not favor promoting the community as a whole, but rather selected leaders. The latter, of course, by preserving a state of alienation, which Wendy mentioned, hinders the emergence of consciousness." This is key. It's like every step they take is to hinder the emergence of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
And critical intervention in a total reality. And without this critical intervention, it is always difficult to achieve the unity of the oppressed class. And to Wendy's point about the class conflict, the oppressors hate any discussion about it because it's a lot easier to win a fight when the person you're fighting doesn't know they're in a fight.
Accurate.
And, yeah, and it's even easier when they're punching the people that are on their side.
Yeah.
And so if you can, and we've seen it, I think we're going to have an opportunity in the near future on the Left Project podcast to talk about it more. But Chicago is kind of a case example of this, in that you've seen a lot of devastation and trauma and terrorism inflicted on communities by the government, and that the divisions that they sow are intentional. And this is a strategy. One of the things I liked about this part of chapter 4 is it kind of lays it out as here's what they're doing. This is their strategy. These are the tools that they have. Here's how they use them, and this is what you can expect. And in 40 years, they haven't really changed much. The methods and the strategies that oppressors use have been somewhat modernized, but they're very predictable. And the countermeasures for revolutionaries to employ are also, we don't have, as Wendy mentioned earlier, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are methods and strategies that may need updating or modernization, but that they've been thought through. And some of the immediate questions, like whenever you go to a website, there's the FAQs about these questions. These are always the questions that people ask. So why don't we just put the answers out there? This is the FAQ of the revolutionary movement of sorts. And this particular part kind of gives you, in my perspective, what I pulled from it was some of the frequently asked questions about, well, how do you fight this, or how do you not imitate that oppressive behavior? How do you not follow the footsteps? How do you not organize in a way that empowers the oppressors rather than disempowers? And so the plucking of leaders is a big one. And so I think Black Lives Matter realized this right away, at least initially, that they didn't want to identify leadership, both for personal safety reasons, but then also from a leadership perspective. When you identify leaders, it's easier to corrupt and contain and do various other actions that limit their effectiveness. When you raise the consciousness of an entire community, you can't just go in and pluck out the Martin Luther King Jr. and publicly assassinate him to scare everybody, because everybody is everybody, and everybody is one, and in a community that is revolutionary and ready to raise towards liberation. And so you, as Hampton would say, one of my favorite people to quote, is you can jail a revolutionary, but you can't jail a revolution. And so when you make figures, you present people that you can capture and change, and then shift towards the good, towards your use. And I'll avoid a modern example to not cause any things else, and also to move us along. But that is very critical from what I picked out from 143, is that leadership has to be viewed as in the same kind of dynamic as the teacher-student relationship that he describes in previous chapters, about a cooperative relationship in which we're both doing something. That doesn't mean that there aren't distinct features among revolutionary leaders that may not be as prominent in revolutionaries, but it does mean that we are one and the same, and that our goals and that our methods are intended to follow the same path.
One of my other, in addition to the leadership part, which I think is really good, the false leaders part is
Hmm.
really great. Later down on 146, where he's still talking about methods of divide and conquer, another one he gives is about the false generosity of the oppressor, excuse me, which he talks about earlier on. But he says here on 146, second paragraph, quote, a psychoanalysis of oppressive action might reveal the, quote, false generosity of the oppressor as a dimension of the latter's sense of guilt. With this false generosity, he attempts not only to preserve an unjust and necrophilic order, but to quote unquote buy peace for himself. It happens that peace cannot be bought. Yes, this is true. Peace is experienced in solidarity and loving acts, which cannot be incarnated in oppression. And this is like very important because I think we often see people with massive amounts of money and massive amounts of power kind of doing small charity projects as if to make themselves look better among the public and make it look like, to sort of confuse the population basically, so that when you think of that person, a good one is Bill Gates, you say to yourself, oh no, but Bill Gates does so much great work in the third world, and Bill Gates does so much, like so many community projects, and he donates to this and this. But also you're like, wait a second, and you and I talked about this when we talked about climate change in the episode that we did in December. But one of the things that we both mentioned was like the fact that these projects often work to hide the damage and destruction they're doing, and they don't come close to giving back the community what they've taken away from them, right? So it's never even, and it's always a sort of ruse to make themselves look better. The last thing, really quickly, that he talks about in this section that is also important for us to keep in mind in the present is the way history is also distorted in order to keep these divisions going. And sometimes unconsciously so, like people don't even realize that it's being used in this way, but it might be. So he gives the example of a movement that was happening during the colonial period in Brazil that's actually about people trying to, like take down a corrupt and incredibly oppressive government of the, the Portuguese. And they were called conspirators, the Inconfidencia, the conspiracy. And that's has very negative connotations, right? So it's amazing that when you look back and you think about a very important historical moment and it has this air of negativity around it. And that's because the naming was done by oppressors, right? The naming is not done by the people who enacted this plan to overthrow a corrupt government. So you can kind of think about a more contemporary and US-based example, the discussion around riots, right? So we talk about riots all the time as though people are just like destroying their own property and they're burning down CVS and this and that. But in actuality, they're responding to oppression. And it's not a riot. It's ultimately a form of revolution, no matter how big or small. And it's with time where we can look back and say, okay, this is a revolution. So like things like the Haitian Revolution were not called a revolution for a very long time. So it's important that we remember that sometimes history and our remembering of things, and I would say often, not just sometimes, is at the hands of people who are doing the oppressing. It's not in the language of the people who are fighting for change and who are fighting for revolution.
Absolutely. And one of the things I just remembered too is just that when you go through these, the conquest, the divide and rule, and the next we're going to be touching on manipulation, and then it ends with cultural invasion. It's basically U.S. history, more articulated, it's basically U.S. history better articulated than you'll find in any grade school textbook.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, you could throw all those away and just put this in there, and that would be more helpful, in my opinion.
I agree.
It is exactly what we did, or what was done in the United States, and that it especially, I think, comes to light in the last section. But before that, we'll get to manipulation.
Yeah. And by manipulation, what he's basically talking about is the ways that people who are dominant elites, the oppressors, etc., try to make regular degular, as our friends over at Millennials Are Killing Capitalism, regular degular people conform to their beliefs and enact the needs and wants of the elites and the people in power. It works hand in hand with the idea of myths that we discussed already, but it's this idea that basically what seems like is supposed to be working for you and to help you is actually helping the bourgeoisie, the wealthy, the elite continue to achieve their goals, which then further your own oppression. So it's like a cycle of of seeming change that actually just helps people who are trying to hurt you.
And he describes it using the example of the populist politician, in that the populist, like, it seems to me that he's making the distinction in that a populist is using manipulation to essentially act as a mediator between the bourgeoisie elites and then the masses, and that,
Mm-hmm.
but that by the nature of the deception, the manipulation, and all of those things, it by its very function, its nature of existence is acting on behalf of the oppressors, even if they themselves view themselves as an intermediary between the two. And one of the things that kind of touches on both that and what we were just talking about with plucking leaders, and it's kind of random, but I was watching an RT from Unreported World, which has its problems, but also has some good reporting on there as well. But basically, it was the backstory of a Congolese man who was, somebody in the Congo, and kind of the history, and basically how he ended up being hired by the UN, getting paid large amounts of money to essentially explain to his people that, why these horrible atrocities. He was there during the Rwandan genocide as well, and lost his wife, and it's a very sad story. But anyway, the point being is just that he made a lot of money being an intermediary between his people and the UN, and capitalist forces that were exploiting his people. And at one point, he just had to say no more. And that's where I think a lot of people are at in their lives, that they're seeing all this exploitation and all this horribleness going on around them, and they want to say no more, but they don't know how to say no more, how to rebuild their world without the comforts that they've become accustomed to as a result of the exploitation that they were either unaware of or put out of mind. And go ahead. I was just going to say, I think the text helps, but go ahead.
Really quickly, it also, the best way to summarize this section is to talk about intermediaries or sheepdogging as well, just to put it in like one word. So later on in this part, he says, in a situation of manipulation, the left is almost always tempted by a quote unquote quick return to power, forgets the necessity of joining with the oppressed to forge an organization, and strays into an impossible quote unquote dialogue with the dominant elites. And ultimately, he says, you cannot dialogue with the elites because the elites and the oppressors are always thinking about their own positionality, their own wants. You cannot dialogue with them ultimately. And while it seems like this intermediary or person who's in the act of sheepdogging is dialoguing on your behalf with that group, as in the example you just gave, they're not. They can't represent your interests to that group because ultimately that group doesn't give an F about you, and so it's, he goes on, this again hit so close to home with 2016 and now 2020. He says this process ends by being manipulated by these elites, and not infrequently itself falls into an elitist game, which it calls quote unquote realism. So basically this sounds to me like the discussion we hear all the time about pragmatism, right? Like you gotta be realistic. You have to just come along with the herd, even though we're taking you to your own slaughterhouse, just come on in. And ultimately this process.
Look at that disruptor running the opposite direction, away from the slaughterhouse. Stop that one.
Yeah, so like this part definitely, again, like the whole book hits home, but this part I think is particularly applicable to what we see in national elections. And we have a lot of people who serve as bourgeois intermediaries, and ultimately they're not our friends, basically. Yeah.
Well, no, and I think the cultural invasion would be the next section that really stuck out to me, and I think this hits home for Indigenous comrades more than most folks, in that it describes how white supremacy invades and co-ops a culture. It's not specific to white supremacy, but I think that's how a lot of, at least of our U.S. listeners, will interpret it, and then also Indigenous will see just Western colonialism in it. But essentially, one of the quotes that stuck out to me was, in this phenomena, the invaders penetrate the cultural context of another group in disrespect of the latter's potentialities. They impose their own view of the world upon those they invade and inhibit the creativity of the invaded by curbing their expression. And goes on to say about like prevents them from naming their world. It oppresses them from naming their world. And I couldn't like it was a very vivid like connection to the treatment of indigenous people in the United States, especially in that like and throughout Western domination and imperialism throughout many countries, of refusing to allow the population to name their world. So this is taking away their gods, their history, their structures, and reappropriating or reassessing their holidays, their all these types of things, where they impose their way. This is very deposit oriented, banking oriented. We're going to deposit civilization into these people and fix their shortcomings with no respect for how the value of their naming of the world. And that's a very stark example, but it's very easy, like, and it's hard to imagine how could people be so horrific. And it's like, but you'd be surprised how easy it is to just do in your everyday life. And like, chances are you've done it any one of us have done it in the last 12 months, like to somebody, and we have our justifications and our rationalizations, but it's very, very easy to just cast the people off in that way.
And it's also, I mean, just looking at this, I immediately thought of language quite literally, how if you're seeing language as a key element of culture, right? I mean, when you learn another language, it gives you so many insights to how the culture functions. And like, just imagine, your group speaks a specific language, has an understanding of the world based on that language, and then that's taken away from you, that's forced out of existence, literally in some cases. And what that means. Yeah, oh yeah, for sure. And also, he goes on to talk about somewhat the ways that we're just trapped again in the same cycle of not being able to see our own oppression because it's been like that's been conditioned out of us, right? So he talks about on page 157, he says, for an alienated person conditioned by a culture of achievement and personal success, to recognize his situation as objectively unfavorable seems to hinder his own possibilities of success. And like this part reminded me so much of what we see at the end of Michelle Alexander's book about this idea of the false idea of Black exceptionalism, and how just because one Black person makes it, quote unquote, makes it, starts to make money, becomes president, whatever, it doesn't necessarily mean that that person's individual success is indicative of what's going to happen with the whole community, nor is it even indicative of the reach that that person has in his or her own power. Like, or it's not, is it really success if the position that you inhabit is one of the oppressor? Like it looks that way on the surface, but ultimately, like, you're performing a disservice against yourself, against your community, against so many people. It doesn't necessarily mean something positive, and I think that the constant reinforcement of values that aren't necessarily our original ones, that aren't our own, but that are instead embedded in this like hyper capitalist, individualistic way of seeing the world, that's so harmful. It continues to be harmful to us. And I think it just goes back to this idea of the cultural invasion, because the values we did have of communalism that go back in very many indigenous societies in the Americas, in Asia, in Africa, that's been erased in large part. People are trying to find it again through different means. But I think that it's hard for us sometimes because we're still stuck within a cycle where the idea of success is based on how much money you make, how big your house is, and not like how large your community is or how many people you're close to or what you can do to contribute to helping someone else. That's not how we base success.
Yeah, many of the measures of success are very anti-dialogical, counter-revolutionary, and oppressive. I mean, It's like one that comes to my mind is, like family living situations. It's like, in the U.S., it's very, if you're for the longest time, and it's changed over as the economy's gotten worse. But when you leave your parents' home, it's a very large signifier of your value to society. And it's very interesting in that, like in various other cultures, I know, and particularly in like Italian cultures, it's not uncommon in a variety of other cultures for people to stay at home until they're married off, or then also communal living where even in the US, I know there's some immigrant cultures that will have 8 to 10 people in a home and until they can pay off that home, and then they spread out to a new home, and that's how they progress through spreading it. But it's like there's also this sociological aspect of, well, if you don't fit these certain pre-ascertained ideas of success, then you're failing, even if what you're doing is actually leading towards liberation as opposed to away from it. So somebody who's working at Amazon collecting a 6-figure check and donates 10,000 to some water sources in Africa is rewarded socially as being better towards liberation, towards freedom, towards caring about the impoverished than somebody who just has to work to get by and takes at least an hour out of their month that they don't really have to spend to do something to work towards liberation. It's like that difference in how we value our social contributions, and that the economic indicator is so highly valued versus the social positive impact. And that then you got your Jeff Bezos or your Bill Gates or even George Bush receives a lot of praise for his help in Africa, when essentially what he was doing was imposing Western Christian ideas of abstinence only and putting a bunch of money behind that and not making the problem actually better, rather than the issue better, rather than doing the type of intervention like condoms that would actually have the effect that was desired to lower the AIDS rate. And so it's like the way that these systems interact with each other and build on each other and prevent opposition. I picked this up early and I've only begun to understand it more, but it's kind of awesome in the sense of not like good, but in like inspiring awe and a sense of just disbelief at the efficiency of the system to self-perpetuate. So you don't even need bad individuals. You could take a bunch of good-natured, good-intentioned people and just drop them into the system, and the system can manipulate them and reinforce all of the negative aspects and turn a good community into a destructive community within a generation.
Oh, not even. You don't even need a generation, sadly.
And it's, I mean, I mentioned before Chicago, and it's just another example of like some of the most radical, positive, powerful movements were coming out of Chicago and Oakland. And we see now, after the terrorism and the destruction wrought by government, both Republican and Democrat, so this isn't a partisan issue. Hanrahan was a Democratic. He was being groomed to be Daley's replacement. So this is very bipartisan and decades in the making, that the destruction and terrorism is intentional to alienate and to diffuse and to destroy that energy, those movements, the class consciousness, the recognition of class conflict, because it threatens them. It is a real threat to the people that benefit from it, and they're going to fight tooth and nail. And as we've seen through the 60s, they'll do whatever it takes. Absolutely.
So there are a few more subheadings. When we said we were done, we mean just with one like section of the subheadings. So yeah, do you want to take over from here? Keep going.
Yeah, essentially what we have from Freire in the second set of subheadings is kind of the revolutionary perspective on the headings before. So instead of divide and conquer, we have cooperation. Instead of invading, there's cultural synthesis. And we could spend hours going over just this section, and we don't have the time. Our goal in our efforts is to share with you, and especially for me, is to share with you this learning process as I'm attempting to raise my critical consciousness and be more able to identify and transform the world around me, and in that act become more fully human. That I'm just trying to share that experience with you, so that in hopes that we can do that together. And that's really at the core of what Freire was writing, and it's just reassuring and reaffirming that was kind of what I set out to do, more or less, and realize that I was a role that I could fulfill. And it's like, so I don't mean to to deposit this information into anyone. It's not my intention at all. It is, but to just share with you what I'm doing and give you my side of the dialogue, and in the ways that you can, through Twitter and elsewhere, for you to share, and then just to open up these lines of dialogue with the people around you, because that's where it's really important, is getting offline and interacting with the communities that you are a part of, that you don't get to necessarily choose to be a part of, the ones that where you live, and the places that you frequent, and the people that are a part of your life. That's where the systematic and structural oppressions meet the personal level, and that's where we can rise together as a community, and achieve liberation. And while I have no intentions of trying to deposit this information into any of you, I would like to take this moment to remind you that we do appreciate if you could deposit and make any deposits into our Patreon, becoming a comrade or just donor, and helping us do these things, and help recognize that the work that we're doing does take labor, and that the labor that's being put into it should be compensated. And if you're pulling things of value out of this, I just humbly request that you are able to make those deposits. And if I recognize that not all of us are able to, and so the things that you can do, sharing, liking, commenting, positive reviews, all those types of things are very helpful. And you'll probably, around the same time this comes out, I'll have recently gone through a bunch of comments and liked and followed a lot of you that have said positive things. And that's probably something I'm going to just try and do more of, is that if you're saying positive things and your timeline looks like something that is not something that I either already have a lot of, or reflects a perspective that makes sense to me in some way, or I find enlightening, I will absolutely make sure to follow you back. And for some reason, I know that that's a big thing on Twitter, just get those follower numbers up. And so if that can incentivize you to help engage in your critical consciousness, that's the least I could do. And I just want to thank everybody again for this opportunity, Wendy, and everyone that's helped bring this together, Noah and everyone. And just, I'm really just happy to be a part of this, and I just want more people to have something like this to be a part of.
Cool. And much appreciated. And again, the feeling is mutual. I wouldn't have brought you on if I didn't think you could handle it. You could do a good job. No, but I just want to say too, just quickly, to wrap up with Freire, there's some points at the very end, like literally last page of the book, that I think are so important and like have to be mentioned before we go. And I also want to spend some time, maybe after I put this recording out, to go back through the book again and put out some of our quotes that we've discussed from the book, and maybe especially from the sections that we didn't get a chance to go into in greater depth, but that I've definitely got highlighted like crazy. But I do want to talk about those, and perhaps I'll use the social media, either Facebook or Twitter or both, to do that. But one of the things that he closes with is this real emphasis on critical consciousness. If you want to achieve critical consciousness, he says, to achieve the critical consciousness of the facts, that it's necessary to be the, quote, owner of one's own labor. And that labor, quote, constitutes part of the human person, and that, quote, a human being can neither be sold nor can he sell himself. Is to go beyond a step beyond the deception of palliative solutions. So in other words, this isn't easy. This process is not free, free in the sense that, everything's just like easy and it's going to happen and, fall out of the sky for you. You have to work towards change. You have to have an understanding of what you're doing. You have to also have an understanding of the conditions in which you're working and the process that other people are going through in order to get to the point where they see that need for liberation themselves. But also just like, again, super basic socialist, communist ideas, which is, if you work hard, you need to see some of that back. It shouldn't be just you're working to help someone else get rich, for you to have the free time and the energy to sit down and read a book, to sit down and theorize, to sit down and think. You have to have some semblance of humanity that's recognized by the powers that be. And I think that that we see people making these attempts and moving towards some sorts of policies and governance that looks closer to that. But I think we also just, books like this remind us that we have to constantly be on top of those people. We have to constantly push for more. And we have to always be aware of what's happening to people who are in even more dire states than we see, in our own communities, what's going on in communities that are suffering even more, to fully understand that and to fully make demands that are based on our understanding of what's happening and what people tell us and articulate as what is happening to them, instead of just going in and saying, we're going to save you. I'm going to speak on your behalf, and not listen. So, I love this book. And I highly recommend anyone who's been listening to this to, as Richard said, definitely share this conversation, share some of the quotes that I post, share the free book, which is available on Patreon for free for everyone, no paywall, nothing. And also just to communicate as best as you can some of the things that, if you had a chance to read the book in part or in full, what you learned from it, and how you can work with others in communicating that. So yeah, that's my takeaway.
Yeah, and definitely feel free, if any of you feel like you're able to apply this to any stuff that you're doing currently, definitely share that with us. I'd love to hear anything like that too.
Oh yeah, that would be nice. Like if we had a tweet thread of, this is how I applied Freire in my own organization or organizing or groups that I'm involved in. That would be really cool.
I'd love to be able to amplify that. So send that our way, please.
Well, I think that's all for our third and final. I'm almost sad. Our third and final episode on Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I would love to actually revisit this at some point, if we can, maybe in the future, to have a more sussed out conclusion. But yeah, it's definitely something I encourage everyone to check out. And I think that's it for now. But we're gonna come back to this, I have a feeling.
Yes. I'll definitely be revisiting this text personally, even if we're not able to broadcast it or anything about it. It's been invaluable already, and 2020 is wearing on my nerves. So I need something to help keep me in line.
Yeah, God, it's like already at that point, and we've got another year and a half to go.
Yeah, it's still 2019.
I'm sorry, we have another year and a half to go just for like the primaries practically. I mean, that's how much we have left. So
hang in there, everyone. And thank you for being with us.
And thank you for listening to the Left Pocket Project podcast. Be sure to check out more on the podcast by looking up LeftPOC, and that's LeftPOC on Spreaker, iTunes, Patreon, or SoundCloud to find the podcast itself. You can also find more about the project by going to the Patreon page, and that's patreon.com/LeftPOC. There you can also donate $1 or more to help us keep the show running and the project alive. We actually did a breakdown of where all the money goes that we posted on Twitter. So I'll be sure to link that on the Patreon page, which again, all content is free. You'll be able to see, and you can donate if you feel like this project is worth your time and you're enjoying what you hear. In the meantime, be sure to share, like, comment on the project and the podcast, and tell a friend, tell a family member, tell a colleague about what we're doing here, because we think it's really important to help spread the word far beyond social media and far beyond the realm of the internet. We want to make sure that people are listening, reading, and following along with this project through multiple means. So thank you so much again, and have a good one. Bye.